Imagine standing in a cool, damp rock shelter on the slopes of Mount Carmel, roughly 13,000 years ago. Beneath your feet are graves lined with beds of colorful, fragrant wildflowers. Right next to those freshly buried bodies, someone in the tribe quietly pours handfuls of wild sprouted grain into a deep stone mortar, carved directly into the bedrock floor. They crush the seeds, grind them into a mash mix, then with spring water, and leave the bowl sitting in the dark. A few days later, the liquid inside begins to transform. Tiny bubbles rise and pop across the surface. This drink is nothing like modern beer. It isn't clear, it isn't cold, and it definitely isn't fizzy. It is thick like gruel, intensely sour, chunky, with bits of crushed grain, and carries a completely unpredictable alcohol content. And yet the people gathered in that cave carefully pass this bowl of fermented mush around, taking sips together in the middle of a sacred ritual honoring the dead. They have no concept of yeast or microorganisms, but they understand a powerful, repeatable law of nature. If they follow the exact steps of gathering, sprouting, grinding, and soaking, this ordinary mixture will alter their minds. But was this actually the moment human beings started drinking alcohol? Or had ethanol already been quietly shaping our ancestors' diets for millions of years? Today, when you walk into a store, the world of alcohol is neatly divided into strict, orderly categories. Beer is brewed from grain, wine is fermented from grapes, mead is made from honey, and spirits are distilled. Every bottle or can on the shelf has a precise label, a standardized recipe, and an alcohol by volume measured down to the decimal point. But our prehistoric ancestors didn't live or think inside those neat taxonomic boxes. In the ancient world, a single clay pot might hold whatever was available: crushed barley, wild berries, raw honey, aromatic herbs, river water, and a wild menagerie of airborne microbes. The result was an extreme fermented hybrid, something that functioned like beer, tasted like fruit wine, and provided the heavy calories of a liquid meal. So when modern archaeologists label an ancient liquid as beer or wine, you have to remember that those are just 21st century approximations. Those are definitely not the words or concepts the ancient brewers used in their own minds. That forces us to confront a fundamental question. What does the first drink of alcohol actually mean? When you look deep into evolutionary history, humanity's relationship with alcohol is broken down into three completely different milestones. The first milestone is accidental exposure. When an early hominin ancestor ate overripe fruit that fell to the forest floor or drank tree sap that naturally fermented in the wild. At this stage, there was no recipe, no specialized tools, and likely no conscious intention to get drunk. The second milestone is deliberate brewing. When humans actively gathered ingredients, mixed them with water, on purpose controlled the waiting period, and replicated the results over and over again. This was the massive leap where fermentation shifted from a natural accident into a human technology. And the third milestone is social institution. When alcohol began to be produced at scale, stored in dedicated pottery, and placed at the very center of funerary rituals, communal feasts, and political alliances. The biggest mystery for science is which milestone do our oldest artifacts belong to? And how can a hollowed-out stone mortar or a broken shard of clay actually prove that what sat inside of it thousands of years ago contained alcohol? The hardest part of this investigation comes down to the chemistry of ethanol itself. The ethanol molecule is incredibly fragile and fleeting. It evaporates rapidly into the air, dissolves easily into groundwater, and is eagerly consumed by bacteria that turn it into vinegar and other compounds. After thousands of years buried in the dirt, there is never a single liquid drop left for scientists to run through a lab spectrometer. So to prove ancient drinking, archaeologists have to play detective and hunt down a trail of microscopic indirect clues. They search for plant starch granules that show physical damage from sprouting and heating. They use microscopes to examine tiny silica structures called phytoliths, trapped deep inside the scratches of grinding stones. They scrape invisible black residue off the inner walls of pottery to find tartaric acid and other chemical organic markers of fermentation. And they look at the surrounding context. Was this vessel found in a normal domestic kitchen, inside a sacred tomb, or in a ceremonial feasting pit? Yet standing alone, each of those clues can be misleading. A stone mortar could just be for grinding flour to bake bread. A clay jar showing fruit traces might just be a winter storage locker. The presence of grapes doesn't automatically prove the presence of wine. Archaeology cannot dig up a prehistoric intoxication. The only thing science can uncover is a pattern of organized, deliberate behavior. A sequence of steps where the only logical explanation for the effort is that humans were actively trying to engineer fermentation. And by following that trail of microscopic clues, scientists have reconstructed 5 major pieces of evidence that completely rewrite the history of alcohol. Evidence number 1 reveals that our biology mastered alcohol long before we ever brewed a drop. When evolutionary geneticists reconstructed ancient versions of the ADH4 enzyme, the primary enzyme responsible for metabolizing ethanol in the primate digestive system, the results were stunning. Around 10 million years ago, the common ancestor of humans and African great apes experienced a sudden genetic mutation that supercharged our body's ability to process ethanol. This doesn't mean that 10 million years ago, ancient apes were hosting cocktail parties in the jungle. It proves that our ancestors adapted to survive in an environment where natural ethanol was a regular heavy part of their daily diet, overripe fruit fermenting on the forest floor, tree sap pools and nectar traps swarming with wild yeast. Your body didn't wait for the invention of civilization to learn what alcohol was. We didn't invent the alcohol molecule. We simply invented how to concentrate it, produce it in bulk, and make it appear on command. Evidence number 2. Rakafet Cave shows that humans brewed beer before the dawn of agriculture. For decades, history books told a neat, linear story. Humans settled down, invented agriculture, farmed wheat to make bread, and then accidentally used the leftover grain to invent beer. But the discoveries inside Rakafet Cave in Israel shattered that neat timeline. There, archaeologists excavated stone mortars dating back 13,000 years, belonging to the Natufian culture. When they analyzed the microscopic residue inside the basins, they found wild starch granules that had been malted, mashed, and heated. It was the unmistakable chemical fingerprint of brewing beer. The miracle is in the timeline. 13,000 years ago, the Natufians were still hunter-gatherers. They had no true farming villages, and wild cereals had not yet been domesticated. These people invested massive amounts of intense physical labor to forage wild grains and pound them into beer, long before they ever became full-time farmers. Evidence number 3. The Jahus site preserves the complete chemical fingerprint of a 9,000-year-old brew, while Rakafet Cave mostly reconstructs the process from stone tools and damaged starch. A Neolithic village in China's Yellow River Valley, the Jahus site delivered intact pottery vessels dating between 7,000 and 6,600 BCE. When modern chemists ran lab extractions on the residue, bailing to the clay walls of these jars, they unlocked a startlingly clear recipe. A complex fermented hybrid made from rice, wild honey, and fruits like hawthorn berries or native grapes. At Jiahu 9,000 years ago, fermentation wasn't just an indirect guess from a grinding stone. It left a crisp chemical signature proving the intentional production of a mixed alcohol inside a permanent settled community. Evidence number 4. Neolithic winemakers in the southern Caucasus designed an entire system for long-term storage and preservation. At sites like Gadakrili Gora and Shulaveris Gora in modern-day Georgia, dating to around 6,000 BCE, archaeologists uncovered massive clay jars lined with tartaric acid, the absolute proof of large-scale grape wine production. Just a millennium later, at Haji Firuz Tepe in the Zagros Mountains of Iran, jars revealed grape wine mixed with terebinth tree resin. The resin wasn't an accident. It was a brilliant natural preservative that sealed the wine from the air, preventing bacteria from turning the alcohol into vinegar. This marks a massive cognitive leap in human behavior. Brewing was no longer about mixing a bowl of fruit and drinking it a few days later. Humans learned to coordinate seasonal harvests, press grapes, and bulk store the liquid in giant underground clay vessels to stabilize the temperature and use pine resin to lock out oxygen. Fermentation officially became the art of long-term planning. And evidence number 5, the oldest traces of alcohol, are always found next to rituals and community bonding. There is an astonishing common thread tying together Rockefet Cave Jiahu Village and countless other prehistoric sites. The earliest brewing equipment is almost never found in normal domestic houses for private casual sipping. At Rockefet, the beer mortars were carved right beside flower-lined graves inside a sacred cave. At Jiahu, the alcohol vessels were placed in ceremonial feasting areas and elite burials. In a harsh prehistoric world where calories were hard to come by, you didn't waste massive amounts of precious grain and honey just so one person could sit around getting drunk alone. Alcohol was born as a supreme social glue. It was brewed to be shared at communal feasts, honoring ancestors, to mark life cycle milestones, to reward collective labor when building monuments, and to blur the boundaries between the living and the spirit world. That brings us to a psychological twist that shook the foundations of anthropology. For centuries, we believed that bread was the sole reason humans gave up the freedom of hunting and gathering to break their backs farming fields. We assumed people wanted stable bread to survive, and beer was just a happy byproduct made from the leftovers. But the beer before bread hypothesis, supported by the raw evidence from Rockefet Cave, suggests the exact opposite. Bread is a labor-intensive, complicated product. You have to grind grain into fine flour, knead dough, add yeast, and bake it over fire. Primitive beer is vastly simpler. You crush the grain, soak it in water, and let nature do the work. More importantly, the intense human desire for a mind-altering beverage that catalyzed ecstatic group rituals, bonded tribes, and smoothed social tensions was likely a much stronger motivator than the desire to eat a dry slab of baked starch. It doesn't have to be a battle between beer or bread. Fermented drinks were likely a massive part of the cultural engine that made wild grains worth foraging, processing, defending, and eventually taming through agriculture. So how did Stone Age humans, without the slightest clue about microbiology or organic chemistry, master such a complex biotechnological process? They didn't need a microscope. They possessed something greater: empirical observation and a genius for recognizing repeating patterns in nature. The process unfolded through a natural 5-step logic. Step 1 was finding sugar. With fruit or honey, simple sugars are already unlocked and ready. But with grains, the energy is locked away as hard starch that yeast cannot consume directly. Step 2. Our ancestors discovered the magic of malting. When you soak grain in water and let it sprout, natural plant enzymes wake up and slice those rigid starch chains into sweet, fermentable, simple sugars. That is exactly what the Natufians were doing in those rock mortars 13,000 years ago. Step 3 was the arrival of the microbes. Wild yeast is everywhere, floating on the skins of wild berries, drifting through cave air, or sleeping inside the microscopic cracks of wooden stirring sticks and clay pots used in previous batches. When that yeast hit the warm, sweet grain mash, it began eating sugar and burping out ethanol and carbon dioxide. Humans couldn't see the microbes, but they saw the explosive life. The liquid bubbled with white foam, released an intoxicating new aroma, shifted in taste from sweet to tangy, and above all, delivered a warm, euphoric buzz when swallowed. Step 4 was learning to repeat the successes. Through endless trial and error, a tribe learned the golden rules: which pottery jar produced the best brew, how thick the mash should be, what weather made it ferment fastest, and when a batch had gone sour and needed to be dumped out. And Step 5, when that empirical wisdom was encoded into oral traditions and ritual instructions passed down through generations, brewing officially transitioned from an accidental discovery into a reliable biotechnology. Yeast was making alcohol millions of years before we showed up. Humanity's real breakthrough was learning how to build a house and a pot to force those invisible creatures to work on our schedule. When you look deeper, the invention of alcohol reveals a profound evolution in human psychology and social organization. When you find a ripe bush of berries in the wild animal, instinct screams at you to eat them immediately for quick energy. But to brew a batch of alcohol from grain or fruit, humans had to do something completely counterintuitive: delay immediate gratification. They had to harvest way more food than they needed for the day. They had to invest days of exhausting physical labor just to crush, mash, and boil it. They had to patiently lock that mixture away in the dark and wait for days or even weeks. They had to guard and defend those clay pots from wild animals and rival tribes. And above all, they had to place absolute trust in the future, believing that when the brew was finally ready, the tribe would still be alive and together to share it. Prehistoric alcohol was never the product of an impulse. It was the physical embodiment of collective memory, extraordinary patience, disciplined division of labor, and calculated resource management. Ethanol takes just a few hours to alter the chemistry of the human brain. But to brew that first intentional sip, humans had to fundamentally alter how they organized time, labor, and society itself. Understanding that ancient journey reveals why our relationship with alcohol today is in such a strange, precarious imbalance. For tens of thousands of years, the alcohol our ancestors drank was relatively low, in proof fluctuated wildly in ethanol strength from batch to batch, spoiled quickly, and was always consumed alongside heavy fiber-rich communal meals. Most importantly, it couldn't be produced continuously or shipped across oceans. Alcohol was tied strictly to seasonal harvests, weddings, and funerary feasts. Today, through industrial yeast strain selection, automated temperature control, sterile filtration, precise proofing, and modern distillation, we have completely stripped the ethanol molecule away from its original biological and social context. Your body and brain are running on a 10-million-year-old biological software evolved to process small, diluted, unpredictable doses of natural ethanol. But modern industry has turned that familiar molecule into a mass-produced, highly concentrated, dirt-cheap commodity available on every street corner, 24 hours a day. We aren't drinking the ceremonial brews of our ancestors anymore. We are consuming a high-tech, frictionless, hyper-optimized delivery system for intoxication. We will never know the name of the very first human ancestor who tasted a fermented fruit fallen on the forest floor. But 13,000 years ago, inside the misty caves of our past, our ancestors started doing something vastly more bold and beautiful. They learned how to save their seeds, be patient with water and time, and invite invisible creatures to transform them into a sacred drink, so the living could raise a cup to remember the dead.